July 11th is World Population Day, the day news media ignore the topic of human overpopulation, and the United Nations tap dances around the subject. Well, not here. The U.S. needs a comprehensive population policy. We're going to roll up our sleeves and work on what that should look like next.
The presidential election in 2024 is probably the most important election in our country's history.
You're looking at a Biden-Trump rematch that two-thirds of the country doesn't want.
I'm Dave Gardner. I'm running for president.
The billionaire class has been taking everything and leaving everybody else to fight for the scraps.
You're right to talk about economic growth and restoring that American dream.
Gross domestic product has now become a fetish.
You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your fairy tales of eternal economic growth.
We humans have outgrown our planet.
Is growth really making us richer, or is it making us poorer?
We've got to scale back.
We need people to reimagine a lifestyle which requires much less energy and material.
Didn't Elon Musk actually say one of the biggest issues that we're facing is underpopulation?
Let's not be afraid to talk about overpopulation, because it is not about taking rights away from people. It is about giving opportunities to women, children, and future generations.
Welcome to Dave the Planet, the podcast that chronicles my presidential campaign and digs into its key issues. I'm running in order to get the nation out of ecological overshoot. If you're not familiar with overshoot, see the show notes for links to some good background. To end overshoot, we need to be accountable for the size of our ecological footprint and commit to its contraction. To shrink that footprint, we need to reduce our material and energy consumption, and we need to voluntarily and ethically contract our population. So the U.S. needs a modern, comprehensive population policy. I've laid out the basics on the campaign website. See it at davetheplanet2024.com/population. Now, I've invited some of the very smart people I would ask to be on my President's Council on Population Policy to workshop some ideas with me in this episode. I couldn't get everyone in the room at the same time, so I had to settle for just 4 of them right now. The expert advisors convened for this workshop include Phil Cafaro, professor of philosophy at Colorado State University and senior researcher at the Overpopulation Project. He's the author of a few books, including Life on the Brink: Environmentalists Confront Overpopulation. Carter Dillard, who served on the steering committee of the Population Ethics and Policy Research Project at the University of Oxford. He's Director of Strategic Initiatives with the Animal Activist Legal Defense Project at the University of Denver College of Law. He's also Policy Advisor at Fair Start Movement and author of the book Justice as a Fair Start in Life. Trevor Hedberg is Assistant Professor of Practice in Philosophy at University of Arizona's Franke Honors College, and author of the recent book, The Environmental Impact of Overpopulation: The Ethics of Procreation. Karen Kuhleman, finally, a sustainable population scholar who's authored several good papers, including Overpopulation, or the Stories We Tell Ourselves, Population Governance, and the Right to Procreate, and the Legitimate Scope of Antinatalist Policies. She's a UK-based attorney. I'll include links in the show notes to the fine work of all of these people. I had to record separate earlier conversations with Karen Kuhleman and Phil Cafaro, so I've edited some of their comments into the conversation you're about to hear with Trevor Hedberg and Carter Dillard. After a century of runaway population growth, mistakenly celebrated and pursued, we need to turn things upside down, root out pronatalist policies, and implement policies that encourage and reward small family choices. Are you guys ready to help me sketch that out?
I think so.
Yeah, sounds good, Dave.
Great. Well, we're going to talk in a minute about pronatalist policies we need to get rid of and about policies to signal how much our society is going to value small family decisions. But first, let's just address the foundation of my population policy. It's got 2 points. 1, ensure every child is born onto a healthy planet with clean air, abundant water, and a life-friendly climate. And 2, to ensure every child is born to parents who want and cherish that child and can provide for her needs. Do you have anything to add or say about these foundational principles?
Those are wonderful goals. They should be our goals for our children and our grandchildren going forward. I would just add that in a world of 8 billion people, 340 million Americans, it's going to be impossible, essentially, to achieve those goals. There's no way to preserve the ecosystem services we depend on, the habitat and resources other species depend on to continue existing, without decreasing human demands on the biosphere. So that's the challenge going forward.
When you recognize that children are people, you recognize that they have rights of their own and that you wrong them by bringing them into harm. Because we just give parents such a pass.
I guess one thing I would ask you about is those sound like global goals in terms of scope. And as a lot of our focus, I imagine, in the discussion today is thinking about U.S. policy specifically. And so one question would be, to what extent is it the U.S.'s responsibility to try to promote goals of a global scope? Like, why isn't the main focus, hey, let me make sure that every child in the United States has access to clean air, clean water, is born into parents that love them, and so on? Like, why the global scope in this context, and how would that translate to U.S. specific policy?
That's a great question. Obviously, I have to focus my platform and the policies I'm proposing on where we can make a difference. And of course, the U.S. needs to be a good global citizen, and we can make a difference and have some responsibilities worldwide. But of course, I think the main thrust of the details we might talk about today will probably be very U.S. focused. But I think we need to set a good example. And of course, there's always a question about how much we should poke our nose into other countries' business. But I think more and more we're finding that nations around the world are getting that we're in overshoot, and they're getting that they can't keep their populations out of poverty without doing some important work on birth rates and populations. So I think it'll be, there's a lot of opportunities for international collaboration. I think I worry about if we actually put the words U.S. in there, does it sound like we're being selfish and we don't care about the children of the world? So I'm glad you brought that up, because I think I should watch for that closely and figure out where do we need to specify U.S. and where should we not. And Carter, these foundations were really inspired by the amazing work that you've done with Fair Start movement. So I definitely want to give you a chance to comment and let us know if you think we need to add anything to these principles.
I mean, I think one possibility is just to frame these under our universal obligations in the human rights regime. Really, after 1948, national policy was limited by nations' obligations to comply with human rights. And the big mistake we see at the time that the work was being done between 48 and 68 was that any human right would begin with the right of that human as a child. And any children's rights to be honestly taken seriously and fulfilled, those children's rights would have actually defined reproductive rights so that children aren't born into conditions that violate their rights. But that work was never done. So I think one possibility to thread the needle between domestic focus and international focus is to say, well, we all have obligations, whether it's our domestic interest or we're thinking about it more internationally, to fulfill every child's right under the Children's Rights Convention. Because if we don't do it abroad, we will be facing immigration pressures here, things that could affect domestic politics, like ensuring the election of a troublesome president because of the immigration pressures. And at the same time, we may have obligations. If there's a billionaire in the United States who made their money by not having to pay the climatological costs of their wealth costs largely being felt in sub-Saharan Africa, those people may owe money to foreign families that are actually being harmed right now through climate reparations. So I think one thing would be is we might have a reason to think internationally for the interests of our own domestic well-being.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and I'll include in the show notes a few links to both of your important work and specifics to the work that you're talking about, Carter. There, because I think that's some things that a lot of people haven't really thought of. I know that the United Nations is needed, and that we need to be having those conversations there. I have, so little faith. The United Nations seems to be as politically correct as anybody, and that's especially demonstrated around World Population Day with the way they tap dance around the whole subject of overpopulation and even population growth. So I think it's really important that the United States be accountable for the size of our ecological footprint, and therefore that means the size of our population. We've got to do what we can, regardless of what other countries do. But I think there's definitely a role for us to play in assisting other countries in following the lead that we need to be providing. And we haven't been a leader in ever, probably, but definitely not in recent decades. Let's circle back to the international stage after we go through a few of these U.S. things, because I do want to talk about international aid, for example. Another thing that I really want to kind of get out of the way up front is, a lot of times there are assumptions that any policy about population is a policy about coercion. And I absolutely don't endorse coercion, and it's not needed. And I want to be upfront about that, but give you guys a chance to underscore that or disagree with that if you feel a need to.
There's an awful lot that I think I could say here, but just thinking specifically in the U.S. context, one of the most recent sort of forms of coercion we see is that it's getting more difficult in certain parts of the country to access means of contraception, and especially after the Dobbs decision, abortion services. This is a foreseeable outcome, but basically states that banned abortion, in the aftermath, they've seen their birth rates go up. Imagine that. But what we have in the U.S. actually is like the more common form of procreative coercion is people having to have children that they don't want. And so the idea that, I understand where that impression comes from, that population policies historically back in the 60s and 70s often were coercive in the angle of trying to get certain groups of people to have fewer kids. And they targeted certain people who were poorly educated or of a particular racial identity. Those were obviously unjust and wrong. But in the modern day, I think in a lot of contexts, the more common form of coercion is women being forced to have children when they don't really want to. And so just removing that form of coercion could make a lot of progress in the United States. I also think that among the most effective measures we have, the non-coercive ones, increasing educational opportunities for women, giving free access to contraception, and in general, just promoting gender justice are the most effective and also some of the most cost-effective things we can do. But there's also this range of policies that in some of my older work, I describe these as almost like semi-coercive, which I don't think was the best label, but they're not clearly coercive, and they're also not like what I would describe as autonomy enhancing. So things like media campaigns or advertising, where you're trying to you're trying to basically shift people's preferences, make them more friendly towards, say, having a small family as opposed to a large family, or trying to get them to think about the issue in a different way. That kind of stuff to me is kind of on a par with just general advertising, where I would not say that it's just outright coercive. I think that's where most of the really interesting questions about how we respond to population is in that intermediary zone. I think we have historical evidence and also some good moral arguments for why outright coercive measures, we're going to force you to have sterilizations or abortions under certain circumstances, doesn't seem like the best way to go. I'm open to the possibility that things could get desperate enough, I suppose, that maybe if you had a totalitarian state that was actually able to implement those things and situations were bad enough, maybe it's hypothetically possible that could be permissible. But I don't think that's the situation we're in. And so my inclination would be, let's do all the stuff we can on the autonomy enhancing side, and then let's take seriously some of the hard questions in that more intermediary zone.
I don't think people have a right to say, I can do whatever I want with my procreative apparatus and have as many kids as I like under whatever conditions I like. Definitely, they don't have a right to do that. They definitely have a right to not have children if they don't want to, because that doesn't affect anybody else. It only affects them. But from then on to think about policies, I feel like given the substratum of culture in the United States, there's a lot of potential for a policy that tells people, don't have kids if you can't support them. Don't have more than 2 kids even if you can support them. To just backfire because people say, you don't tell me what to do, and then just behave in a contrary-wise fashion just to assert their independence. And then you just get worse results for children and society and the planet.
You might think one way to influence family planning decisions is through what India used, which were financial incentives. You pay people to wait or not have children. Those could be re-understood as entitlements for future children. So you can't have children until you are positioned to give the child what they are entitled to. And then the question becomes, well, where do we get that money to pay for the entitlements? Well, if the uber wealthy around the world owe future generations for not having paid the climatological costs of their wealth, we might start with their money and using that money to fulfill entitlement accounts. Now, that's where the question of coercion gets interesting, because you might think, well, government has the right to coerce its populace to follow the laws. Well, no, under liberal theory, governance derives from the people. And so arguably, young women, in order to entitle themselves to raise future generations in a way that constitutes democracy, would have a superior claim to use coercion to get the resources they need to then bottom-up constitute governance in a democratic way. Do we have the right to use coercion to target billionaires to pay for birth entitlements? I've never found anyone to show me why that's not the case. Now, getting it done is a different matter, but as a matter of theory, it's maybe a type of coercion we haven't thought about.
That's just a great example of how smart the people are that I propose to have on my President's Council of Population Policy. That's some pretty advanced thinking, Carter, and we could only get that from an attorney.
Actually, Trevor's really a leader in the real field of the academy. We're just out there pontificating in a way to provoke people. But it's Trevor that does the real work to fill this in with actual research.
Both of you guys are doing important work.
I do want to follow up briefly, because I do think that Carter gets in his remarks that one of the important things in talking about coercion is to think about why is coercion objectionable? And typically it's because it either restricts someone's autonomy in some significant way, or because it just causes outright harm. And the reason why taking money from billionaires to potentially fund the types of entitlements that Carter was talking about maybe doesn't seem as intuitively objectionable is because they're not going to be outright harmed by having a small portion of their ludicrous wealth taken away. Their quality of life is not going to go down as a result. And also, their autonomy is not going to be restricted in any meaningful sense. This is, directly different than if we're talking about coercion where we're targeting people of lower socioeconomic status.
Just to kind of wrap up the coercion topic for now, there's a lot of people are wringing their hands about losing their freedom. A lot of people are really clinging to freedom. People are complaining that you're trying to take away my gas stove, for example. And I just want to point out that, of course, the bigger the population of the U.S. or the bigger the population of the world, the less freedom we're going to have. Just the more we crowd the planet, the more likely our behavior will impact another human being, and that's going to result in loss of freedom. And that kind of speaks to what you said, Trevor, about if it got bad enough, maybe coercion would have to be on the table. But for now, I just want to say, if I was elected president, I don't plan to dictate family size. I really just want to, I want everybody to have a daily reminder that we're in ecological overshoot, and make sure that every couple making a family size decision is aware of that so they can make an informed decision, and then have other population policies that maybe help remind us of the kind of behavior that we want in order to provide a good future for our kids. So I know I hinted at the prospect of financial incentives and disincentives. I don't think we need to get into a lot of detail about tax credits and the like, but I think right now we have a number of policies like that seem to be pronatalist, and so they signal to society that we want children, and the more the better. Now that more and more countries are experiencing a peak of population and either anticipating or already in population contraction, because so many of them are addicted to growth, they're really wringing their hands in depopulation panic. And so they've already been trying financial incentives to get women to start birthing them more workers, consumers, taxpayers. And I'm just going to say that's a really lousy reason to bring a human being into the world. If your kid asks you, "Hey, why did you and mommy bring me into the world?" you don't want to say, "Well, we needed a tax credit," or we wanted a more robust economy. That's just ludicrous. But the studies seem to indicate that those incentives aren't very effective. They at most might, move the needle just a little bit, and feel free to offer other information if you're aware of it. But so I don't think that changing these tax credits is necessarily going to have a huge impact on people's behavior. It might make a little bit of difference at the margin, and it might change a couple's list of pros and cons on whether to start a family or whether to have another child or not. But in most cases, they're not going to be the deciding factor in family size decisions. But I do think they signal what society values. And I think in the 21st century, we really need signals that are up to date and reflect the fact that we've got carried away and outgrew the planet. So I think it's important for us to change those. And I also think in the future, if there are some baby bust alarmists reelected or elected into policymaker positions, it would be that much harder for them to return to the old ways if we've completely turned those policies upside down.
It's very possible that it's sort of like Trump's Overton window. One way you respond to an argument is by saying something untrue and somewhat outlandish to expand the possibility of what people might believe. If you were nations facing liability for the deaths of children in heat waves, and having diluted each person's democratic voice to meaninglessness, if you were faced with that liability, you might do something outlandish by saying, "Oh, we just don't have enough people, and we should be paying people to have children." I actually think that a lot of the attempts to do that, and a lot of the mainstream media, from the New York Times to the Washington Post, beating this drum, are people in power, they've been in power for decades, who are looking at serious liability for what is happening around the world. And they benefited from a system that costs others, in many cases, others' lives. And so I actually view that this overstep in terms of pushing pronatalism now as an admission of, quite frankly, just how disconnected they are, but also maybe that they're aware of some liability. That would be my sense. And I also, one thing, if you were going to start with entitling future children to like a savings account before they're born, starting with all the funding going into pronatalism is probably a good place to start.
The more generous you are in payments for childcare, time off for women and men who want to take time off to raise kids, as you put in place those policies, it does have a measurable impact in driving up fertility rates. So that's a big part of the reason demographers think that Swedish and Norwegian fertility rates are about half a child or a third to a half of a child higher than fertility rates in Italy and Greece and Spain. You have much better social welfare programs in the north of Europe than in the south. And that means it's easier for couples to start a family, have an extra kid, and that means they're having more children.
Policies that do seem to have more of an effect are the policies that basically relieve the parents of some or all of the costs of having a child.
I think a lot of the challenge in changing people's minds about this is just how subtle and embedded some of the social norms around procreation are. Procreation occupies kind of a privileged position in discourse where you don't have to justify procreative decisions to other people, even though you're doing something that has, you're creating a new life and thus creating a person who will have interests and welfare that can be set back or promoted. It's a kind of unique decision. It's obviously pretty morally significant, but you don't typically, as parents, have to justify your decision to start a family or to have an additional child to others. Oftentimes, the default response when you disclose that you're expecting another child is for the other person, whoever they are, to just congratulate you on it. It reinforces this idea that procreative choices are like private choices that are beyond moral scrutiny. And that's, to me, is the thing that has to be uprooted for discourse around this to change and for people's general ideas. Like, we need to be approaching procreation, I think, as a morally weighty decision that should be made responsibly. And I just think a disconcertingly large percentage of decisions to start families or to expand families are made based on things like social expectations or just a general sense of, oh, well, I'm 30 now. This is just the time when people have kids. And a lot of the important elements of the decision, I think, just get kind of tossed by the wayside. People will consider things like, am I making enough money to support a child? Or, am I living in a district with good schools, for example? Or they'll think about things like that, but not maybe the bigger picture question of, do we have too many people in this country, on the planet? To what extent is my decision to start a family going to affect others, like other families or other future children or whatever? A lot of that stuff, I think, doesn't get discussed to the extent that it should. And part of it is because the default attitude toward procreative decisions is, if you decide to have a child, most people will say, yeah, great, go for it. And maybe that shouldn't be the default reaction.
Yeah, I think that's an area where advertising can be helpful, where some kind of a public communication campaign to really accelerate the shifting of that norm that's outdated would be a big part of my Bright Future project for sure.
I do think one way to maybe start to crack that, which I agree with Trevor, I think it's the big problem. What's perceived as private is probably the most interpersonal thing you can imagine. I do think we've seen movement with discussions of child abuse. 5 children die at the hands of their parents every day in the United States. 70% of those were under 3. And in many cases, the conditions involve torture. So explaining to someone, oh, look, should everyone have children? Maybe not this person that slowly beat their 2-year-old to death. Oh, of course not that person. There may be one way to break it. And unfortunately, with 5 dying a day, it's not exactly insignificant.
If you look at some of these, what I think have pronatalist components to them today, child tax credit, earned income tax credit, child independent care credit, and even some welfare things like food stamps and temporary assistance for needy families, usually just called welfare. All of these have the amounts that a family or a person might receive go up with the number of people in the household or the number of dependents. So would you agree that we want to make some changes to that to try to eliminate some of the pronatalist components? But kind of the overarching conversation I want to have with you guys is philosophically, they make the most difference to people at low income levels. So reducing these amounts could actually cause a hardship for some children alive today. So I think that's kind of the challenge, is figuring out a way to eliminate the pronatalist signals and maybe eliminate the incentives that might cause families in the future to choose to have more kids, but not plunge kids today into poverty.
I think it's a really, really hard balance to strike, honestly. And I've struggled with thinking about this particular issue quite a bit. One solution you could say is you only make people eligible for these kinds of credits below like a certain income level. But then you're, in a weird way, creating an economic incentive for people who have like potentially less opportunity to give their children good lives, right? To have more kids than people who are middle class or people who are upper class. And that, and maybe at a certain level of upper class, it doesn't matter. You have so many, you don't need tax credits to be able to provide your kids good lives. But when you go down the ladder, what you said earlier about the fact that a lot of these tax credits don't seem to move the needle a whole lot, at least in the United States, is interesting to me. I'm not familiar with that particular empirical data.
Yeah, back in 2019, I and a colleague published some population projections for the European Union. And preparing for that, I talked to a lot of European demographers. And the consensus seemed to be that some of these pronatalist positions could do a small amount, maybe tick up a few percentage points, the fertility rates. But that they really didn't make a huge difference.
I have also wondered about whether there might be ways to use that as a measure of like encouraging people to adopt children, like give larger tax credits to people, because children who you're adopting, they're already here. You're not increasing the population size by adopting a child in need.
And adopting is expensive.
Right. And so there might, and I'm not sure exactly how promoting adoption versus biological procreation figures in to your general kind of policy scheme, but I definitely think that there's a case to be made for trying to find a way to integrate it in. There are even some folks who have argued that basically if you're a prospective parent and you have a choice between adopting or biologically procreating, that you would be doing something morally wrong to biologically procreate over adoption. The idea being that morally the priority should be to save already existing people or to promote the interests of already existing people rather than creating new people. I'm not sure I would hold a view that radical on that particular issue, especially given that there can be additional burdens with adopting children in various circumstances. But if there, but one way of counteracting some of these pronatalist biases we talked about would be, well, try to encourage people to adopt and reduce any stigmas that might be associated with having adopted children. And promote that behavior more over biological procreation.
Hadn't thought of that. That's an interesting idea.
And I absolutely agree with Trevor. I don't know that there's a magic current policy solution. I think in part the entire reproductive rights and health regime has to move from a bodily autonomy sense that the parents have in procreating to something that's based more on children's interest in equity, and equity defined as equal and influential share in their democracy. So it accounts for both population and the quality of life. But I think one policy tool is interesting are baby bonds. So this idea that why should only rich kids have trust funds, maybe poor kids should too, and Cory Booker and others have championed baby bonds. I think if they took those bonds and said they should be geared around delay, preparation, and the parents' participation in adding to those accounts as they prepare and delay, that might be one way to move all of the money being spent on pronatalism into something more effective. So you would use inequity to drive delay, which would also reduce family size. And I think we have a pilot version of this going on in Uganda through Rejoice Africa Foundation. But again, given the disparate influence of very impactful, environmentally impactful children in the United States, love to see that move here.
Yeah, it makes good sense. I assume that we should have some concern about the fact that changes in some of these policies might result in working class people having fewer kids and wealthy people having more kids because these policies don't affect them. Should that be a concern?
I'll admit I don't like the idea of how many children you have becoming a symbol of social status. There's something kind of feels wrong about that. I do think it's interesting, though, empirically that as people's, it's not the case that as people's income goes up that they want to have tons more children. At least in most cases. Part of me wonders how much of this is not a practical concern because there's like an upper bound of family size that even the wealthiest people wouldn't want to go above. You do have some people who have advocated for like extreme pronatalist stuff, like who are very, very wealthy, like billionaires, saying that like, we want other billionaires to have like 8 to 10 kids and stuff like that. But I think that's a pretty rare view. So part of me wonders how much of this is like is just strictly a theoretical concern versus a practical concern. But I do think that you want to have a means for people who are lower on the socioeconomic spectrum to be able to have children in some degree of equity with people who are higher up that socioeconomic ladder. You don't want it to be the case that if you wind up in being poor, then you're just screwed. Your life is already harder in a lot of other ways, and also if you really want to have a family, you can't have that either. This is not a good situation from a standpoint of social justice. So you don't want to wind up with that outcome. But there is also the idea that people who have more wealth and more resources, other things equal, will be able to better promote the interests of children they have. So this is a difficult tug of war to balance these moral considerations.
Well, the children of the wealthy, will have a bigger footprint, and so I'd love to find a way to discourage that. And you kind of brought up the next question I was going to ask was whether we owe it to people to make it affordable to have children. There's an awful lot of conversation about that, and that feels pronatalist to me in many ways. You're probably familiar with some of the work that Travis Reeder, the ethicist, did, where he kind of took us through his logic and reasoning to figure out whether he and his wife should conceive a child. And he made a pretty good case for having one child. But he said it would be very hard to make a case for having additional children. But the experience of being a parent and bringing a child into the world, that's a pretty unique experience, and it's harder to make a case against that, although it's getting easier and easier, I think. So I'm wondering whether it might be smart. And of course, part of this is I'm trying to anticipate every objection to these policy shifts and make them as unobjectionable as possible, but effective at the same time. What if we have really generous assistance to couples who are child-free and really generous assistance to couples who have their first child, but provide no financial assistance for second, third, and beyond?
I'd like us to continue to be generous in helping young families, but to try to do what we can to get rid of some of the incentives for having larger families.
One thing you have to be cautious of is there's really has been a strong movement to avoid capping benefits based on family size if it impacts the child born, if they somehow suffer the consequences of reduced benefits. So in some ways, you might be in a situation where you would have an incentive plan for smaller families like benefits, but you'd have to still pay for children that are born out of plan. You wouldn't penalize them. You'd have to accept a certain amount of noncompliance, expensive noncompliance. But we do that anyway. I mean, every policy we have has some level of noncompliance.
I don't think supporting parenthood is something that makes sense right now. If we weren't in the mess that we're in, if we had been a more responsible and prudent species, not taken in by some sort of philosophy of bacteria for the last many decades, centuries maybe, then I would say yes, because forming a family is a quite central experience that many people cherish. Those that want to have a child and feel that they would be good parents and that they have the conditions to raise a child, but perhaps need a little bit of help, that would make sense, that we as a society would help everyone have a fair go at the experience, and also to make sure that the children have the best possible start in life.
One other way you could think about it is if we truly have harmed future generations and we owe climate reparations, large families of billionaires will owe the most. And that, if it were the fact that they owed climate reparations and could be targeted as such, that might be a disincentive for them to have lots of children, which would drive up their costs. Also, arguably, the children carry the parents' debt. So it's not like, if you're born and raised in privileged conditions that result in harm to children around the world who are suffering heat waves, those children will carry the debt. So you're basically putting a debt on your children's head by being wealthy and having lots of kids. So I think one disincentive for large wealthy families would simply be to start to call in the climate reparations debt.
So Dave, one question I wanted to ask was what your target might be for the fertility rate in the U.S. in the long term, or at least while we're in the state of ecological overshoot, because it has been coming down in the last 8 to 10 years or so in particular. When I was researching stuff for my book, the fertility rate in the U.S. was around 1.8 children for a fertile woman, and 2.1 in the developed world is replacement. And most recent data we got from 2023, if it winds up panning out, is a little bit above 1.6. And depending on what projections you look at, that could either be an anomalous blip and we might bounce back up, or that could continue a downward trajectory just as things currently are. And I think that the number of policy reforms you put in place probably is dependent to some degree on how fast and how far you want to contract the U.S. population. So I was curious what you had in mind, and at that bigger picture, longer term.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. Of course, I want to make sure that it isn't just a blip and that we don't return to higher levels. And of course, we're going to be working really hard in my administration to curb our overconsumption and to really scale back the size of our economy and the material throughput there. But people, we haven't really demonstrated much of a willingness to skinny up our lives. So that's going to be a heavier lift and probably take longer. So I think that just makes it that much more urgent that we work on the population lever aggressively, since we've been demonstrating for 60 years. Women have been demonstrating that they are really more interested in having fewer children and not spending their entire life just raising a family. I'd like to see us get our fertility rate as close to 1 as we can for the next 100 years, 150 years, because I think it's an emergency. Every member of the United States population is a carbon footprint, and we're really struggling with the urgency of the climate disruption that we're causing. I mean, that's not the only negative consequence of being an ecological overshoot, but that seems to be one of the more urgent things where we're really starting to pay the price today. So I'd really like to see a more dramatic reduction, but of course it would be temporary. Eventually, we would return to around 2.1. We would want to do that. But we're at, close to 350 million today, and depending on our level of consumption, a sustainable U.S. population is going to be really less than 100 million. That doesn't require us to murder anybody or euthanize anybody, but the faster we can get there, within 100, 150 years with pretty aggressive reduction in birth rates.
I guess I can imagine folks though at that low of a rate of like close to 1. I think there would be a lot of concern about demographic imbalance of having too many non-working members of the population relative to the working class. I also think some folks might wonder if it would be better, from thinking about climate change specifically, just instead of worrying about population given that, assuming that we had a trend of consistent downward trajectory, even at a slower rate than maybe what you're outlining, some folks might say the better policy angle to go would be heavily invest in renewable energy and decreasing U.S. dependence on foreign oil and things like that. Go for reforestation, increase carbon sinks, stuff like that. We have a lot of land in the U.S. Reduce dependence on animal products to try to free up more land, and to reduce, and because animal agriculture has a really large ecological footprint. I can imagine some folks saying the U.S. is doing okay with its fertility rate and its trajectory. Where we have the problem in responding to climate change is in this other stuff that we're doing. It really is just consumption. And yes, that's the harder problem, because we do, as you pointed out, and I totally agree with this, we have good evidence that people will reduce their fertility rates if you create certain social conditions. We don't have a lot of evidence people will decrease their consumption in the absence of government intervention. People seem to really like their high-class lifestyles, and all of the fossil fuel intensivity that comes with it. So it's a tough call. Obviously this is a tough problem. I've advocated in my own work working on things from both ends, both the consumption and the population angle. But I'm just curious what you would say to that person who raises this objection. Like, look, we're doing okay. I mean, U.S. population growth for the longest time has been driven by immigration, not by birth rates. We're doing okay in bringing birth rates down. What we need to be focusing on is these various other kinds of measures to reduce the consumption variable in the equation.
I would say we're just making pitiful. We're not making progress in all those other areas. My administration would be very aggressive about changing that. Everybody's been really focusing on what's politically pragmatic, and 50 years of political pragmatism has gotten us virtually nowhere. So we've got to be really super aggressive about that. But just because we're so far behind on that, and there are really nothing but benefits of reducing our population and having smaller families. Nothing but benefits. It's a beautiful world. So we just need to keep having that conversation.
Yeah, I'd just say I agree with Trevor. I think it's one interesting thing to note. I mean, we distinguish population like it's a laundry list of things we should do. We might deal with diet, we might deal with population, we might deal with immigration, we might deal with not having sufficient fossil fuel taxation. But in some ways, obviously who we are is different than what we do. Something more basic about that. And one question we could look at is, well, if you have a populace that's willing to reduce the quality of its own children's lives by not taking actions that would mitigate things like heat waves. I mean, if you have air conditioning or not, living in increased temperatures and heat waves is a reduction in the quality of life. It's a deadly reduction for people that don't have air conditioning, but even for wealthy families, it can't be considered an increased quality of life. If you have humans that are willing to do that, you either have a government that's so disconnected from its populace that they don't actually represent those people, or if they do represent the will of those people, there's something deeply wrong with those people, and they're having been created would account for something about how they are wrong. So I struggle with separating population as an issue from what we should do, because I'd always want us to become sort of better people in planning these other policies. And better people might just be, why would you do anything that would reduce the quality of your children's life? There's something sociopathic about that. So, but again, that's more of a philosophical question than a policy question. But it might suggest, again, that U.S. policy should be limited by a universal structure of children's rights, that we would not allow parents to reduce the quality of future generations' lives.
Well, thanks for mentioning that. The other thing I wanted to respond to, Trevor, was the imbalance in the different age cohorts. That temporarily there would be a kind of a bubble working its way through our population, where we would have a lot more people, older people, than we would have younger people, and that does present some challenges. The challenges aren't as dire as they are usually portrayed, because during their first 20 years of life, most human beings are not real contributors to the economy. They have costs associated with them, and the older people aren't just a drag on the economy for the full last 20 years of their lives. So that isn't as dramatic of problem as people portray. But also, it's a relatively minor inconvenience compared to having a dead planet. And so I don't think we should let those challenges frighten us away from doing the really dramatic work that we've got to do. We are really in danger of just completely devastating the future of our kids. So we've got to take really dramatic action.
Yeah, I did want to say one thing about how Carter's kind of framed some of this around the idea of you're making your kids' lives worse than your own, in some cases to an extreme degree. There was some research out of the Yale Climate Change Communication Project that suggested that the most effective way to communicate the importance of climate change to people and get them to actually really think about it and maybe engage in some behavioral change or something like that was to get them to think about their legacy, like what they're leaving behind for their children, or for their grandchildren, or however many generations down the line you can push them to think about it. Which kind of makes me think back to the discussion about advertising and media campaigns, and like, how do you pitch this? Because the literature around climate change in the popular media, at least since I've been an adult, has been mostly a sort of doom and gloom narrative around how bad things are getting, and that just doesn't seem to motivate people, very effectively. But framing this around the idea of, hey, don't your kids have a right to just as good a life as you had, or at least like a good enough life, as it were. Do you think that what you're doing might be putting that in jeopardy for your kids? Are you okay with that? That's an interesting way to think about how to approach this problem, and could be more effective than some of the ways you've been trying to motivate people in the past.
Yeah, I think you're providing some good perspective there. I'll rebut a little bit in that it's easy to say doom and gloom hasn't worked. It hasn't. But there are plenty of people who have been adopting other ways of communicating, and that hasn't worked either. So I think there's a place in the conversation for both. There is some scientific evidence that people are a lot more likely to take action to prevent a loss than they are to have a gain. So if they understand what they may be about to lose, it would seem like they might be motivated. And I'm thinking, I'm going to be trying to inspire and motivate people to make some really serious changes in their lifestyle. Stepping off the treadmill that we're on today in service to this overshoot economy is just going to result in a lot more joy. But people need some kind of a motivation to try that. And so I feel like I've got to paint an accurate and dark picture of what's going to happen and what kind of legacy they're going to leave for their kids if we don't. We've got to be motivated to make some changes, and I think that's to avoid a really dark future for our kids. Are there some other policies that I haven't even mentioned that we should be thinking about to provide the right signals? Of course, I think free contraception of all types is an easy thing to do and actually probably saves more money than it costs. And certainly comprehensive sex education, I think, would be an important thing to do. I would want to invest in those. And of course, in the public awareness and education campaign in advertising and things like that we've already discussed. But
I think we should be thinking about incentives for people who choose not to have children. And, at a minimum, these days, the discussion is often about, well, quit badgering people who freely choose not to have kids. Don't make their lives more difficult, let's say. And that's good. I'm for that. But I think it's time, again, on a planet with 8 billion people and counting, I think it's time to recognize that the individuals and couples who choose voluntarily not to have kids are doing something very valuable.
This is somewhat of a side approach. You have families, I know some families that are small families, people that have 1 or 2 children, but they're pooled in with payment structures where it's not done by family size, it's just done by all the families pay equally. So you might have a school event where all the families are charged equally, even though some of the families have 6 kids attending and some of the families have 1 kid attending. You might use that as a way to lever small families against large families. They should not be subsidizing poor family planning, and often cases that's what large families are. That might be another. And a final way, we have it as just a discourse to get people thinking about these issues. Whatever anybody claimed to do on a particular day, I ensured a zero emissions policy, or we saved this many animals, or we fed this many children, or we brought this many people to the polls so they could vote. Ask them about how children entering the world on the day that they said they did what they did impacts their claim. So if it's, I'm ensuring democracy, while each vote was being diluted by growth in a way that undid what you did. You fed children while more children were being born into starvation than you ever saved. We saved this many animals. No, based on the growth rate, more animals entered slaughter factory farms because of demand than you ever saved on that day. And you could play this game certainly for emissions. I reduced emissions. No, you didn't. The number of people emitting doubled in the time that you were claiming to do this work in a particular region. And so that game of basically calling people out on their fantasy world of ignoring the reality of dynamics is another way to force people to think about these issues. It's not the way to make friends, but it's a way to get people to think about this stuff sometimes.
That's a great reminder of why I definitely need you two on the President's Council on Population Policy in my administration, because your level of thinking, the conversations we're having today, those conversations aren't taking place in the halls of policymakers today, and we need to really change that. I intentionally saved till last talking about immigration policy, since the U.S. needs to be accountable for its population size. I intend to move quickly, but very humanely and compassionately towards zero net immigration. And I'm going to do another whole podcast episode to really explore that fully. So we can just leave that off the table, but I want to give you a chance if you want to have any conversation about that or comment on that. We can do that now if you want.
I think this is one of the most difficult questions to answer, by the way, is like how the intersection of population policy with immigration. I'm glad you said you would devote a full podcast to exploring that, because that probably needs it for sure. But I will just ask, like, how would you respond to what we might call like a broad, like, cosmopolitan open borders type objection? So just this idea that people have a certain basic right to freedom of movement, because where you are born radically impacts your life prospects, and that's not something you can control. And so if I'm born in a poor region of Mexico and I want to travel 100 miles north, say, into the United States, recognizing that could radically improve my life, isn't it sort of unjust for me to be prevented from doing that? And I'm just curious, and that's I'm oversimplifying the case a little bit, but how would you respond to that spirit of objection?
Certainly anticipating that. A couple of things. One is that there's an assumption in your comment that moving to the United States improves your life. And, we're a bunch of addicts in the U.S. We're addicted to a lifestyle that we cannot continue. That's a dead planet if we keep on behaving the way we are. So in a way, attracting people from other countries to move into the U.S. today is like a group of heroin addicts inviting somebody to come in and be addicted to a drug, even though you're all going to have to get into a recovery program very soon. So it's a false promise, and we'll be changing that soon. And so people who are really attracted to the old, antiquated, false American dream of just pursuit of accumulation of wealth, they won't be attracted to move to the U.S. anymore anyway. But in a perfect world, it would be great to have open borders. But we're not in a perfect world. We're in a world that's really in a lot of trouble. And so there is just no way for us to get world population back down to the 2 or 3 billion that might leave a healthy planet for our kids. There's no way to do that without every nation being accountable for its population size. If we aren't each accountable for our population size, there's just too many opportunities for nations to stay addicted to growth like the U.S. does. Today, we exploit immigrants in order to grow our economy. We exploit immigrants in order to have cheap food, cheap construction, cheap housekeeping, cheap landscaping. Then there's nothing compassionate or humanitarian about that. We need to fix those working conditions, so that any American, any natural-born citizen would be willing to do that work. If those work conditions are so terrible that only immigrants would do that, how can we sleep at night thinking that we are being compassionate, offering those working conditions to those immigrants? So there's a lot of things that need to change, and we need to have room in our immigration policy for people who truly do need asylum. But at the same time, we really need to end the colonialism that's making conditions in those other countries so miserable, and help people around the world to make it so that they can stay where they were born, which is generally where they would like to stay anyway, instead of leaving their friends and family.
The United States has had a fertility rate below replacement since the mid-1970s, if not earlier. The last couple generations of Americans, in a sense, have freely chosen to stabilize and even reduce our population. During that same past half century, of course, we have hugely ramped up immigration. From 1970, it was about 350,000 net annual. And by the time the Clinton administration came around, it was up above 1.2, 1.3 million net immigration. And then during the Biden administration, the last couple of years, we've been hitting levels that are absolutely unprecedented. For 2023, net immigration was over 3 million people into the United States. At current levels, we're on track to add hundreds of millions of more people to our population by 2100. So if 340 million Americans aren't sustainable, twice that number are not sustainable for sure. So obviously, something has to change. Immigration has to be reduced because we have to end U.S. population growth. There's a cost to that. On the other hand, there are benefits in terms of protecting the biosphere, I think there are also benefits in terms of forcing people in other countries to recognize that they have to improve things where they are, and not just count on being able to move somewhere else. So it's a complicated issue.
Yeah, the way I remember framing the immigration issue in my book was as an example of of maybe moral tragedy, where there is no policy that you can have on immigration into a country like the United States, where the ecological footprint is so high, that doesn't in some way involve injustice to some group of people, future people, perhaps, if your immigration policy is too lax and it results in lots and lots of people immigrating to the United States and ballooning up its ecological footprint, and maybe unjust toward present people if it's overly restrictive, such that some people who may have in some sense a legitimate claim to be able to relocate can't do it. So there's going to be winners and losers of any immigration policy you choose, morally speaking, and it's hard to know how to adjudicate that conflict.
For me, the primary question is the first border is people entering the world through birth and development. And so if that's where we were to focus our efforts, I tend to believe in freedom of migration, and maybe Trevor's implying the same. And for me, the cost of enjoying that freedom, we suffer that. Everyone suffers that and faces national borders because the costs of investing in the correct birth and development conditions consistent with the Children's Rights Convention were never paid by the wealthy. So while as a short-term, more provisional fix, I don't know whether or not immigration reforms would be necessary. I'll punt on that. But I can say we should always be starting at the beginning and charging the wealthy for the costs they've foisted on everybody else, including costs to the possibility of freedom of migration.
And this reminds me, on the international subject, I didn't mention, but of course, international aid, family planning aid would be more robust, I think, as a part of our population policy. We want to make contraception free and convenient and accessible around the world. We want good sex education around the world. And I know there are cultural obstacles to that, and we probably would provide some funding to help with people, especially people in those countries, working on the cultural shift that's needed to end the patriarchy and the violations of women's rights that are resulting in large families today.
A lot of the problem would be solved by just having more frank conversations about family size.
There are some solutions, or at least paths, that seem to me pretty unobjectionable. Like, it seems like everybody wins, like increased contraception access, more reproductive freedom. Hard to object to that sort of thing. But a lot of this stuff is not that simple and involves having to make difficult decisions about who the winners and losers of different policies are going to be, and also figuring out how much weight certain considerations carry. I think we all kind of agree that future generations don't get enough weight given to them in a lot of the current discourse. And that's part of why we are where we are, and why we want to see something change in how these discussions go.
It's clear you guys really have good hearts, and I really appreciate that. And so I hope we can continue the conversations. So thank you very much for lending your expertise to the conversation today. Thanks for watching or listening. Please follow the podcast so you don't miss an episode, including an upcoming episode focusing on immigration policy and another episode digging into behavior interventions for the Bright Future Project, my national project to end overshoot. That's a part 2. And please share this episode or the entire podcast series with friends, family, colleagues, your elected representatives, journalists, students. Don't forget to check out my campaign at davetheplanet2024.com and read about the Bright Future Project, my national project to get out of overshoot. And click on Donate, Volunteer, and Subscribe. Having these conversations is the only way we can create a bright future for our kids. See you next time.